The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Thompson's garage as Jake Reynolds wiped grease-stained hands on his faded denim, the metallic clang of his wrench echoing against concrete walls. His daughter Lily perched on a weathered wooden crate, her small fingers dancing across sketch paper, capturing the world through 8-year-old eyes that saw beauty where others saw decay. The rumble of an expensive engine shattered the peaceful moment. Bill Carter emerged from his gleaming Mercedes like a predator stepping into foreign territory, his designer suit a stark contrast to the humble repair shop's oil-soaked floors. "Well, well," Carter's voice dripped with condescension. "Heard you struck it rich, Reynolds. Inherited that crumbling Whitmore dump-up on Birch Hill." The gathered townspeople exchanged knowing glance. Poor Jake, saddled with that rotting Victorian nightmare that had been the town's eyesore for decades. But as Carter's mocking laughter faded into the distance, Jake's calloused fingers traced something hidden in his shirt pocket, and the faintest smile played at the corners of his weathered mouth. He knew something they didn't. Millfield, Vermont had always been a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Jake Reynolds' business had become the subject of countless kitchen table conversations since the reading of old John Whitmore's will 3 months ago. The inheritance had surprised everyone, especially Jake himself, who could count on one hand the times he'd actually spoken to his late wife's grandfather. Rebecca had been gone for 2 years now, her battle with breast cancer leaving behind not only a devastating emotional void but also medical bills that continued arriving with clockwork precision. The pale yellow envelopes from the hospital billing department still made Jake's stomach clench whenever he found them tucked between the electric bill and Lily's school newsletters. Their modest savings had evaporated during Rebecca's final months, when experimental treatments and out-of-network specialists had become desperate attempts to buy more time. Now, Jake's income from the garage barely covered the monthly payments on the remaining $80,000 in medical debt, leaving little room for anything beyond basic necessities. The townspeople meant well with their sympathetic glances and whispered conversations about that poor man trying to raise little Lily all by himself, but their pity felt heavier than the wrench in his calloused hands. Thompson's garage sat on the wrong side of the railroad tracks that divided Millfield between the working folks and the well-to-do, a distinction that Bill Carter never let anyone forget. The shop had been in Jake's family for 2 generations, its concrete floors stained with decades of honest work and its walls lined with tools that told stories of countless repairs. But lately, even longtime customers had begun taking their vehicles to the newer, shinier shop across town, leaving Jake to wonder if his reputation for reliability could survive the whispers about his personal struggles. The garage's bank account hovered dangerously close to empty most months, and Jake had started selling off some of his father's vintage tools just to keep the lights on. The Whitmore farmhouse perched on Birch Hill like a Gothic monument to better days, its Victorian architecture now a casualty of decades of neglect. The house had been built in 1892 by John Whitmore's grandfather, a lumber baron who had spared no expense in creating a showplace that would demonstrate his family's prosperity to the entire valley. Now, paint peeled from its weathered cedar siding like old skin, revealing the gray wood underneath that had weathered countless Vermont winters without proper maintenance. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of rotting timber and broken dreams, its ornate gingerbread trim hanging at odd angles where pieces had fallen and never been replaced. Upstairs windows stared blindly across the valley, their glass clouded with age and their frames swollen shut by decades of moisture and neglect. The slate roof showed gaps where tiles had slipped free, allowing rain and snow to find their way into the attic spaces where they had done their silent, destructive work. The barn behind the house leaned at an alarming angle, its foundation stones having shifted over the decades until the entire structure seemed to defy gravity through stubbornness alone. Inside, the space was crammed with what most people assumed was junk furniture covered in dusty tarps that hadn't been disturbed in years, cardboard boxes slowly disintegrating under the weight of their forgotten contents, and the accumulated debris of a long life lived in increasing solitude. Old farm implements hung from the rafters alongside objects whose purposes had been lost to time, creating a museum of rural life that no one had bothered to catalog or preserve. The smell of old hay and mouse droppings mixed with the mustiness of decay, while afternoon light filtered through gaps in the siding to illuminate dust motes that danced like spirits in the stale air. Most visitors took one look at the overwhelming chaos and concluded that the barn's contents were destined for the landfill, but Jake had noticed something different about the way certain items were arranged, as if someone had taken care to protect them even while allowing everything else to deteriorate. Carter and his developer friends had been circling the property like vultures ever since Whitmore's funeral, their plans for luxury condominiums barely concealed behind their condolences. The development would bring 48 units of executive housing to Birch Hill, complete with a clubhouse, tennis courts, and enough parking to accommodate the BMW and Mercedes vehicles that would replace the pickup trucks and aging sedans currently scattered around the property. Carter had shown Jake the architectural renderings during one of his friendly visits, glossy images of contemporary buildings that would maximize views of the valley while erasing every trace of the Whitmore family's century-long presence on the land. The projected profits were staggering. Each unit would sell for between $400,000 and $600,000, numbers that represented more money than Jake could imagine, accumulating in several lifetimes of honest work. But Carter's increasingly frequent visits and thinly veiled threats suggested that patience was wearing thin among the investors who had already committed to the project. The pressure from the town council about property values and community standards had been mounting weekly, each notice arriving with the subtle threat that Jake's time was running out. The latest letter had outlined specific violations: peeling paint on structures visible from public roads, overgrown vegetation that exceeded municipal height limits, and the accumulation of debris that attracted rodents and constituted a public health hazard. The fines started small, $50 for the first offense, $100 for the second, but escalated quickly into territory that Jake simply couldn't afford. Mayor Patricia Hoffman had called personally to express the council's concerns about the property's impact on tourism and local business, her carefully diplomatic language barely concealing the ultimatum underneath. Millfield's recent designation as a Vermont historic district had brought new responsibilities and new scrutiny, and the Whitmore property was increasingly being viewed as an embarrassment that threatened the town's carefully cultivated image of quaint New England charm. Sunday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the garage, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent green eyes that seemed to catalog everything they observed. She introduced herself as Claire Davidson, explaining that she was a tour guide researching local history for the Vermont Heritage Trail, her camera and leather-bound notebook lending credibility to her story. There was something different about the way she moved through the cluttered workspace, her fingers tracing the edges of Jake's restored tools with an appreciation that went beyond casual interest. She paused at his workbench, studying the careful organization of wrenches and sockets, the way he had arranged even the smallest screws in labeled containers that spoke to a mind that valued order and precision. When she complimented the Japanese kintsugi technique he'd used to repair a cracked ceramic mug, the art of mending broken pottery with gold to create something more beautiful than the original, Jake found himself studying her more carefully. Most tourists had never heard of kintsugi, let alone recognized it when they saw it. "My wife taught me about it," Jake said, his voice softening as he touched the golden veins that traced across the mug's blue surface. "She said broken things could be made more beautiful than they were before, if you knew how to fix them right." Claire's expression grew gentle, recognizing the weight of loss in his words without pressing for details. "She sounds like she was wise," Claire said simply, and something in her tone suggested she understood the geography of grief from personal experience. Lily looked up from her sketch pad, her face brightening with the sudden enthusiasm that only 8-year-olds could muster. "Daddy fixes everything," she announced proudly. "He fixed my bicycle when the wheel came off, and he fixed Mrs. Henderson's lawnmower when it wouldn't start, and he even fixed the hole in the garage roof when it was leaking on my art supplies." Jake felt his chest tighten with the familiar mixture of pride and worry that accompanied his daughter's unconditional faith in his abilities. Pride because she saw him as capable of solving any problem, worry because he knew how many problems he couldn't actually fix. Claire's expensive camera seemed oddly professional for someone doing basic research, its lens and flash attachments suggesting equipment that cost more than Jake's monthly income. She photographed his tool organization with the attention of someone documenting important details, asking questions about his restoration techniques that went well beyond casual curiosity. "You have a real gift for bringing old things back to life," she observed, watching him demonstrate how he had rebuilt a carburetor using parts salvaged from 3 different engines. "Most people would have thrown this away and bought something new." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with praise that felt too generous for simple necessity. "Can't afford to throw things away," he said. "When you don't have money for new, you learn to make old work better." But Claire's expression suggested she saw something more than frugality in his careful craftsmanship, something that made her linger over each detail as if she were studying the work of an artist rather than a mechanic. Lily took to Claire immediately, chattering about her drawings and insisting on showing her the cool old house that Daddy had inherited, an invitation that Jake found himself unable to refuse despite his growing suspicions about their visitor's true motives. As they walked the quarter-mile up Birch Hill toward the farmhouse, Lily skipped ahead while Claire asked careful questions about the property's history. She wanted to know about John Whitmore's background, whether he had traveled, what he had done for work during the 1940s and 50s. Jake found himself admitting how little he actually knew about his late wife's grandfather, how the old man had been a distant figure who appeared at family gatherings but rarely spoke about his past. Rebecca always said he was sad about something, Jake remembered, but whenever she asked him about it, he'd just change the subject. Claire made careful notes, her pen moving across the page with the precision of someone accustomed to recording important details. The farmhouse revealed its secrets slowly, like an old friend reluctant to share painful memories. Claire moved through the rooms with careful reverence, her trained eye cataloging details that most people would overlook: the quality of the millwork around the windows, the craftsmanship of the hardwood floors that had been hand-cut from local timber, the way afternoon light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years but still held their original glass with its subtle imperfections. In the front parlor, furniture covered in white sheets created ghostly silhouettes that suggested a house frozen in time rather than simply abandoned. Claire lifted the corner of one sheet to reveal a mahogany piano bench with mother-of-pearl inlays, its surface dusty but otherwise undamaged. "This is beautiful craftsmanship," she murmured, running her fingers along the intricate woodwork. "Probably from the 1920s, handmade by someone who really understood the art." Jake watched her examination with growing puzzlement, noting how she seemed to know exactly what to look for and how to evaluate what she found. The kitchen still held the lingering sense of a life once lived: coffee and cinnamon, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of apples that might have been stored in the pantry decades ago. Cast iron skillets hung from hooks beside the wood stove, their surfaces seasoned to a deep black that spoke of countless meals prepared with care. Claire opened cabinet doors to reveal dishes that had been carefully wrapped in newspaper before being stored away, the headlines on the yellowed pages dating back to the 1960s. "Someone took great care to preserve these things," she observed, unwrapping a delicate teacup painted with roses. "This isn't how someone abandons a house, this is how someone prepares for a long absence, hoping to return someday." Her words carried a weight that made Jake look around the kitchen with new eyes, seeing not neglect but intentional preservation, not abandonment but patient waiting. In the barn, mountains of covered furniture created a landscape of mystery and possibility that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. Tarps and old quilts protected shapes that could have been anything: tables and chairs, certainly, but also larger objects whose purposes remained mysterious under their protective coverings. The smell of old hay mixed with something else, something chemical and familiar that Jake couldn't quite identify. Lily discovered the paint box tucked away in a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of wooden crates that had been carefully arranged to shield it from view. The box itself was a work of art-carved walnut with brass hinges that had turned green with age, and a lock that had rusted shut but still held the elegant curves of 19th-century craftsmanship. Claire happened to have the right tools to open it, producing a small set of lockpicks from her bag with an explanation about old houses sometimes having stuck doors and windows that needed coaxing. Inside the paint box, tubes of dried paint lay nestled in custom-fitted compartments alongside brushes whose bristles had stiffened with age but remained intact. A palette knife with an ivory handle bore the patina of use, its blade stained with colors that had dried into an abstract rainbow of artistic history. Claire held the knife with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact, her fingers tracing its worn edges as if reading Braille. "Your grandfather was an artist?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of carefully controlled excitement that made Jake look at her more sharply. He shrugged, admitting he'd barely known the old man and had never heard anyone mention artistic pursuits. "Maybe it was just a hobby," he said, but something in Claire's reaction suggested this discovery was more significant than a simple pastime. She photographed everything: the box, the paints, the brushes, even the way they had been arranged in their compartments, her documentation thorough and professional, in a way that went far beyond casual interest. As they explored deeper into the barn's mysteries, Claire's questions became increasingly specific, probing into John Whitmore's past with the intensity of someone seeking more than casual historical information. She asked about journals, letters, any documentation of his activities during the 1940s, her interest far exceeding what a tour guide would typically need for a heritage trail brochure. She wanted to know if Whitmore had ever mentioned traveling to New York, whether he had talked about knowing any artists or writers, if there were any photographs from that period of his life. Jake found himself growing uncomfortable with the interrogation, especially when combined with the way Claire handled every object they discovered, not with the curiosity of a tourist, but with the expertise of someone who understood value in ways that had nothing to do with sentiment or nostalgia. The turning point came when Claire examined an old canvas stretched across a wooden frame, hidden beneath a paint-splattered tarp in the far corner of the barn. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the protective covering, revealing not a finished painting but a surface prepared for work that had never been completed. The canvas bore the texture and preparation that spoke of professional quality materials, its surface primed with a precision that suggested serious artistic intent rather than amateur dabbling. When Claire mentioned Jackson Pollock in response to Lily's discovery of a torn piece of paper with partial signatures, then quickly tried to cover her slip with nervous laughter, Jake knew he was dealing with someone who was hiding her true identity and intentions. "Just thinking out loud," she said, but her face had gone pale, and her hands continued to shake as she carefully folded the paper fragment and slipped it into her notebook. That evening, after Claire had left with promises to return the following week to continue her research, Jake sat on the farmhouse's front porch while Lily played with the contents of the paint box. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had once illuminated whatever work John Whitmore had done in his barn studio. Jake found himself wondering about the grandfather he had never really known, about the life that had unfolded in this house during the decades when it had been a home rather than a burden. Lily's voice interrupted his thoughts as she held up the palette knife, its ivory handle catching the last rays of sunlight. "Daddy, why do you think Great-Grandpa John stopped painting?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. Jake looked at the knife in his daughter's small hands, then at the house behind them with its peeling paint and broken windows, and realized he didn't know the answer to that question, but he suspected it might be important. In the farmhouse attic the following Tuesday, they discovered a treasure trove that would change everything. Claire had returned with more equipment, this time a more powerful flashlight, magnifying glasses, and cotton gloves that she claimed were for handling delicate historical documents. The attic space was cramped and hot, its low ceiling forcing them to move carefully among the accumulated storage of multiple generations. Cardboard boxes held decades of correspondence, photographs, and personal papers that John Whitmore had preserved with the same meticulous care that had protected everything else in the house. Claire worked through the materials with systematic thoroughness, her professional training evident in the way she organized and documented each discovery. When she found the box of photographs from the 1940s, her sharp intake of breath echoed in the confined space like a gunshot. The black and white images showed a young John Whitmore standing beside easels with another man whose face was partially obscured by shadows but whose presence commanded attention even across the decades. In the background of several photographs, abstract paintings were visible works that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the early development of American abstract expressionism. Claire studied each image with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, her magnifying glass revealing details that spoke to her trained eye in a language Jake couldn't understand. One photograph showed both men working on the same canvas, their brushes capturing movement and energy in ways that suggested not just collaboration but genuine artistic partnership. The setting was clearly the Whitmore barn, its distinctive roof beams and window placement providing unmistakable confirmation that this farmhouse had been the site of something significant in the art world's hidden history. The partial signature they had found earlier suddenly took on monumental significance when Claire discovered a complete example tucked into an envelope with a 1947 postmark. J. Whitmore and Jack P. 1947 had been torn, but the complete version read J. Whitmore and Jackson Pollock, Vermont Summer Series. Claire's hands trembled as she held the paper, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what they had uncovered. Jake might not have been an art expert, but he could read the shock and excitement in Claire's eyes, could see the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid as the implications of their discovery began to sink in. "This can't be real," she whispered, but her voice carried the conviction of someone who knew exactly how real it was. The collaboration that art historians had theorized about but never proven was documented here in intimate detail, preserved in a Vermont farmhouse that the rest of the world had written off as worthless. When Claire tried to deflect Jake's direct questions about her knowledge of art authentication with explanations about art history classes and general interest in the subject, her explanations rang hollow against the evidence of her expertise. She knew too much about canvas preparation, understood too well the significance of signature styles, handled the materials with the reverence of someone whose career depended on making such assessments. Jake's suspicions crystallized into certainty when he watched her photograph the signature with the methodical precision of someone building a case file rather than satisfying casual curiosity. "You're not really a tour guide, are you?" he asked quietly, and the way Claire's shoulders sagged told him everything he needed to know about the deception that had been unfolding between them. Something far more valuable than old furniture was hidden in this barn, and Claire Davidson, or whoever she really was, knew exactly what it was and why it mattered. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Lily innocently revealed Claire's true identity after finding a business card that had fallen from her purse. The child's discovery hit Jake like a physical blow, the elegant script reading Claire Mitchell, art authentication expert, New York City, like an indictment of everything he had begun to believe about their growing friendship. The betrayal cut deeper than Carter's open mockery because it came wrapped in kindness and understanding, disguised as genuine interest in his life and his daughter's artistic development. Claire's attempts at explanation felt like salt in wounds that had barely begun to heal from Rebecca's death and the financial devastation that followed. "So this was all research?" Jake's voice carried the weight of every disappointment he had ever endured, every time someone had pretended to care about him when they really wanted something else. "The tour guide story, the interest in local history, the way you looked at Lily's drawings, was any of it real?" Claire's face crumpled with an anguish that seemed genuine, but Jake had learned not to trust his ability to read people's true intentions. "I know how this looks," she began, her voice breaking with emotion that could have been real or could have been another performance. "But you have to understand, I came here to disappear, not to work. I never intended for any of this to happen." She spoke of a career-ending mistake in New York, of a family who had lost $50 million because she had authenticated a forgery that had fooled experts around the world. The scandal had destroyed her reputation overnight, turning her from one of the most respected voices in art authentication into a cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of overconfidence. But Jake heard only the confirmation of his worst fears, that he was just another project for someone whose world moved in circles he could never hope to enter, someone who saw dollar signs where he saw memories and meaning. "You people are all the same," Jake said, his voice growing harder with each word. "You look at someone like me and see an opportunity. Poor mechanic doesn't know what he has, probably grateful for any attention from someone with class and education. Was that the plan? Befriend the stupid single dad and his kid, gain their trust, then swoop in and claim the treasure?" Claire's protests that she hadn't been looking for anything valuable fell on deaf ears because Jake had heard similar denials before from insurance adjusters who had minimized Rebecca's treatment options, from lawyers who had promised help with medical bills they couldn't afford, from well-meaning neighbors whose offers of assistance had come with strings attached that compromised his pride and independence. The pattern was always the same: people with power and knowledge taking advantage of people without either, then acting surprised when their victims felt used and manipulated. Carter chose that moment to arrive with his ultimatum, flanked by lawyers and carrying a purchase agreement that represented the culmination of months of increasing pressure. The timing felt orchestrated, as if he had been watching the house and waiting for the perfect moment to strike when Jake's defenses were already down. "Be practical, Reynolds," he sneered, spreading the papers across Jake's workbench like a conquering general claiming territory. "This is more money than you'll see in a lifetime of fixing broken-down cars. $150,000 cash, closing in 30 days. Take it and give Lily the life she deserves instead of clinging to a pile of rotting wood and impossible dreams." The contract was thick with legal language that Jake didn't understand, but the bottom line was clear enough: sign here and walk away from the burden that was dragging down his life and his daughter's future. The pressure had been building for weeks, unpaid bills stacking up on his kitchen table, notices from the town council threatening daily fines that he couldn't afford, whispered conversations about Jake's inability to maintain property that was dragging down neighborhood values. Even some of his friends had begun suggesting that maybe Carter was right, that holding on to the farmhouse was just pride disguised as principle. Tom Bradley from the hardware store had pulled him aside the previous week to mention that Carter's development would bring jobs to Millfield, construction work that could keep local crews busy for months. "Think about what's best for the whole community," Tom had said, his words carrying the weight of collective opinion. The isolation of being the only person standing against the tide of public sentiment was wearing Jake down in ways that simple financial pressure couldn't match. The weight of single parenthood pressed down on Jake's shoulders like a physical burden as he stared at the contract. Lily needed so many things that his income couldn't provide: better health care, educational opportunities, a college fund that currently consisted of $17.37 in a savings account that barely earned interest. The other children in her class went on field trips that cost $25 per student, amounts that might as well have been $25,000 for all the difference it made to Jake's stretched budget. She wore hand-me-down clothes and carried a backpack that had been repaired with duct tape so many times that it looked like a patchwork quilt. When her classmates talked about family vacations and new toys, Lily would just smile and change the subject, but Jake saw the longing in her eyes and felt the familiar knife twist of knowing he couldn't give her the life that other children took for granted. When Claire tried to intervene, her protests about the property's potential value only confirmed Jake's suspicions about her motives. "Don't listen to her," Carter said with obvious satisfaction. "She's been filling your head with fairy tales about hidden treasure while she plans to profit from your ignorance. That's what these art people do. They find desperate situations and exploit them." His words rang with the authority of someone who understood how the world really worked, someone who had never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. Claire's face went white at the accusation, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she struggled to find words that could defend against the truth in Carter's attack. Jake looked between them, the wealthy developer who had never hidden his intentions and the art expert who had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies, and felt the familiar weight of being caught between forces he couldn't control or fully understand. The breaking point came on Thursday evening when Lily, excited about retrieving her forgotten sketchbook from the barn, accidentally stepped through a rotten floorboard and injured her ankle. Her cry of pain and fear cut through Jake's anger like a knife, reducing everything else to irrelevant noise as he focused on getting to his daughter and assessing the damage. The ankle was swollen but not broken, according to the doctor at Millfield General, but the injury served as a stark reminder of how dangerous the property had become and how unprepared Jake was to handle the responsibility of maintaining it safely. As he carried his crying daughter to Claire's car, the only vehicle reliable enough for the 20-minute drive to the hospital, he found himself accepting help from the woman he had accused of using them both, his pride temporarily set aside in the face of parental necessity. Claire stayed through the night at the emergency room, not because Jake asked her to, but because leaving felt impossible when an 8-year-old girl needed comfort and her father needed support he was too proud to request. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the smells of antiseptic and the quiet desperation that hung over medical facilities at midnight, they finally had the conversation that should have happened weeks earlier. Claire spoke about the isolation of expertise, of how knowing the value of things had cost her the ability to simply enjoy them without calculating their worth. She described the pressure of being responsible for authenticating works worth millions of dollars, the way a single mistake could destroy families and reputations with equal ruthlessness. "I came to Vermont to remember what it felt like to look at something beautiful without wondering how much it was worth," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of hospital machinery. Jake talked about the weight of everyone's expectations, of being seen as either a charity case or a failure, never just as a man trying to do right by his daughter. He described the crushing responsibility of single parenthood, the way every decision carried the weight of potentially damaging the most important person in his world. "Rebecca always said I was too proud for my own good," he admitted, "but pride is all I have left sometimes. When you don't have money or status or education, pride is what keeps you from disappearing entirely." Claire listened without judgment, her own experience with professional devastation giving her insight into the way shame could eat away at a person's sense of self-worth. When Lily finally fell asleep in the pediatric ward, her ankle wrapped and her pain medication working, Jake and Claire sat in silence that felt more honest than any conversation they had shared. Friday morning brought the discovery that would transform everything they thought they knew about the Whitmore inheritance. Lily's accident had knocked over an old tarp in the barn, revealing the corner of a canvas that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. The painting showed the distinctive drip technique that had made Jackson Pollock famous, but the canvas bore signatures that confirmed what the photographs had suggested: this was collaborative work, created during the mysterious Vermont period that art historians had theorized about but never documented. Beneath the protective covering lay 47 paintings in various stages of completion, each one signed with the pairing that would rewrite art history textbooks: J. Whitmore and Jackson Pollock. The lost Vermont period, the collaboration that had produced some of the most significant works in American abstract expressionism, was spread out before them like a roadmap to the past that had been hidden in plain sight for over 70 years. Claire's professional assessment was staggering. Conservative estimates put the collection's value at $120 million, making Jake's inheritance one of the most significant art discoveries of the 21st century. But more than the money, more than the vindication of his stubborn refusal to sell, was the revelation that his wife's grandfather had been part of something extraordinary. John Whitmore hadn't been a failed farmer clinging to family land out of misplaced sentimentha, had been an artist whose work had helped define an entire movement in American culture. The junk that everyone mocked had been created by hands that understood beauty in ways the town could never appreciate, preserved with loving care against the day when the world might be ready to understand its significance. "This changes everything," Claire whispered, but Jake was already thinking beyond the immediate implications toward the responsibility that came with such a discovery. The authentication process took 3 weeks, during which Claire worked with experts from major museums to verify what they both already knew to be true. The paintings were genuine, their provenance documented by the photographs and correspondence they had found in the attic. More importantly, they represented a missing piece in the puzzle of American art history: collaboration between two men who had found in each other the courage to experiment with techniques that would influence generations of artists. The letters they discovered revealed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared vision, two outsiders who had created something beautiful together far from the pretensions and pressures of the New York art scene. John Whitmore had chosen to remain anonymous, not from lack of confidence in his work, but from a desire to let the art speak for itself, without the complications of fame and celebrity that would have followed recognition. The news traveled through Millfield faster than gossip at a church potluck, transforming Jake overnight from the town's favorite charity case into its most famous resident. Reporters arrived from newspapers and television stations, their satellite trucks lining the narrow country road that led to Birch Hill. Art experts flew in from museums around the world, each one hoping to be the first to examine the collection that would anchor exhibitions for decades to come. Carter's desperate attempts to renegotiate his original offer fell on deaf ears as Jake found himself in the unprecedented position of being pursued rather than pressured. The same town council that had threatened him with fines now wanted to declare the farmhouse a historic landmark, their enthusiasm for preservation directly proportional to the media attention the discovery had generated. But the real transformation wasn't in bank accounts or property values, it was in the way Jake began to see himself and his place in the world. Claire's decision to stay in Millfield, to build a new life that balanced her expertise with the simple pleasures of small-town relationships, showed him that value wasn't always measured in dollars or status. She established her authentication business in a restored storefront on Main Street, her reputation for honesty and thoroughness attracting clients who valued integrity over flash. Their relationship had grown slowly and naturally, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than dramatic declarations or romantic gestures. When she moved into the farmhouse 6 months after the discovery, it felt like the natural progression of a partnership that had been tested by crisis and strengthened by truth. Lily's natural artistic ability, nurtured by access to the best teachers that Jake's new circumstances could provide, flourished in ways that made both adults realize they were witnessing something special. The restored paint box became her most treasured possession, connecting her to a great-grandfather she had never known while inspiring her own creative journey. Every Saturday, she taught art classes to local children in the converted barn, passing on techniques and enthusiasm with the generosity that had always been her nature. The community that had once pitied Jake now looked to him for guidance on preserving their town's newfound fame while maintaining its character, a responsibility he approached with the same careful attention he had always given to fixing broken engines. The Whitmore Reynolds Foundation was established to support emerging artists and preserve artistic history, ensuring that John Whitmore's legacy would continue to inspire future generations. 6 months later, the Whitmore Reynolds Heritage Center stood as a testament to the power of hidden potential and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The farmhouse had been lovingly restored, its Victorian beauty finally revealed after decades of neglect, while the barn gallery attracted visitors from around the world who came to see where artistic history had been made. The restoration had been guided by careful research into the building's original appearance, with period-appropriate materials and techniques used to maintain historical accuracy while ensuring modern safety and accessibility. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt using plans found in the attic, its gingerbread trim recreated by local craftsmen who took pride in preserving their community's architectural heritage. Inside, the rooms had been returned to their 1940s appearance, furnished with pieces from the Whitmore collection and period antiques that helped visitors understand the context in which the collaboration had flourished. Jake still operated his garage, but now it was as much for the love of working with his hands as for financial necessity. The steady income from the foundation allowed him to be selective about the work he took on, focusing on interesting challenges and helping neighbors who might not otherwise be able to afford professional repairs. His reputation for craftsmanship had attracted attention from collectors who wanted vintage vehicles restored with the same attention to detail that had impressed Claire during her first visit. The garage had become a destination in its own right, featured in automotive magazines as an example of traditional skills being preserved and passed on to new generations. Young people from the local high school came by after classes to learn about engines and craftsmanship, finding in Jake's patient instruction an alternative to the college-bound expectations that didn't fit every student's interests or abilities. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse kitchen windows as Jake prepared breakfast, the same autumn light that had once revealed peeling paint now illuminating gleaming hardwood floors and carefully chosen antiques. The kitchen had been restored to its original 1940s appearance, complete with a restored chambers stove and vintage refrigerator that had been rebuilt to modern efficiency standards. Claire sat at the restored oak table, reviewing proposals for the next traveling exhibition, while Lily sketched at her easel near the window. The collaboration between the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian would bring selections from the collection to major cities across the country, sharing John Whitmore's story with audiences who had never heard of Millfield, Vermont. The paint box that had started everything sat open beside Lily, its brass fittings now polished bright, filled with fresh tubes of color that would carry John Whitmore's artistic legacy into a new generation. There were no grand proclamations of love, no dramatic wedding scenes, just three people who had chosen each other and built something beautiful from the pieces of their separate losses. The coffee cups on the windowsill told their own story. Jake's carefully repaired ceramic mug with its golden kintsugi veins, and Claire's simple white cup that she had bought to match it, sitting side by side in the morning light like a quiet declaration of partnership. Their relationship had evolved through shared responsibility rather than romance, through the daily work of preserving something important while building a life that honored both the past and the future. When Lily had started calling Claire Mom 6 weeks earlier, it had happened naturally, without ceremony or discussion, the way families sometimes form when people simply choose to belong to each other. The sound of car doors slamming announced the arrival of Lily's art class, a group of local children who gathered every Saturday to learn from their young teacher and explore their own creative potential. The program had grown from Lily's desire to share what she was learning to a structured curriculum that attracted students from neighboring towns whose parents drove 30 minutes each way to give their children access to instruction that would have cost hundreds of dollars in urban areas. Jake watched from the kitchen window as his daughter organized supplies and prepared the barn studio, her confidence and natural teaching ability reminding him of Rebecca's gift for making complex things seem simple and accessible. The children ranged in age from 6 to 16, their diverse backgrounds and skill levels creating a dynamic that challenged Lily to adapt her instruction while maintaining the enthusiasm that made learning feel like play. As morning progressed into afternoon, Jake found himself standing in the barn gallery, surrounded by the paintings that had changed everything. The space had been climate-controlled and professionally lit, transforming the former storage area into a museum-quality exhibition space that preserved the building's rustic character while protecting irreplaceable works of art. Visitors came from around the world to see the collaboration that had been hidden for 70 years, their appreciation evident in the hushed tones and careful attention they paid to each piece. Claire joined him there, her hand finding his as they looked at the canvases that represented not just millions of dollars, but the friendship between two men who had created something beautiful together, despite the world's indifference. The afternoon light streaming through the restored windows fell across the paintings in much the same way it had when John Whitmore and Jackson Pollock had worked side by side, creating art that would outlive them both. Lily appeared beside them, her latest painting tucked under her arm, a portrait of the farmhouse as it looked now, warm light glowing from every window, flowers blooming in the restored garden, and three figures visible on the front porch. "I called it home," she announced simply, and Jake realized that his daughter had captured something that no amount of money could buy: the sense of belonging that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly the people who understand your value, flaws and all. The painting would hang in the farmhouse kitchen alongside Rebecca's watercolors and John Whitmore's early sketches, part of the continuing story of a family that had chosen love over convenience and meaning over money. The composition showed the same instinctive understanding of balance and harmony that had marked her great-grandfather's work, suggesting that artistic talent might indeed pass through generations in ways that transcended formal training or conscious instruction. The late afternoon brought Carter's car past the Heritage Center for what had become a weekly ritual, the black Mercedes slowing as it passed the entrance where tourists lined up to purchase tickets for guided tours. Jake had stopped feeling anger toward the man who had once seemed like such a formidable opponent, recognizing now that Carter's mistake had been the same one made by everyone else in Millfield, judging value by appearance rather than taking time to understand what lay beneath the surface. The luxury condominium project had been quietly shelved when other developers realized that the Heritage Center would bring far more tourism revenue to the area than residential development ever could. Carter's reputation as a visionary developer had suffered accordingly, but Jake found himself hoping that the man might eventually learn something from the experience about the difference between price and worth. The evening air carried the sounds of children's laughter from the art studio as parents arrived to collect their young artists, their conversations mixing appreciation for their children's work with amazement at the story of the farmhouse's transformation. Jake listened to their voices while he worked in the garden that Claire had planted behind the house, his hands dark with soil as he tended vegetables that would feed them through the coming winter. The simple pleasure of growing food on land that his family would keep for generations represented a security he had never imagined possible during the dark months after Rebecca's death. The medical bills that had once seemed insurmountable were now just unpleasant memories, replaced by the more pleasant challenge of managing a foundation dedicated to supporting emerging artists and preserving artistic history. As darkness settled over Millfield, Jake found himself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance that had shaped his life. Rebecca had left him with grief and debt, but also with Lily and the understanding that love could survive even the worst losses. John Whitmore had left behind a burden that became a blessing, teaching Jake that value often comes disguised as worthlessness and that patience can reveal treasures that hurry would never discover. His own father had left him with practical skills and the garage that had become the foundation of his independence, proving that the most important gifts are often the ones that teach us how to take care of ourselves and others. But the most valuable transformation was the hardest to quantify, the way Jake now moved through the world with quiet confidence, knowing that his worth wasn't subject to other people's approval or disapproval. The restoration of the farmhouse had become a metaphor for the restoration of Jake's faith in himself and his place in the community. Where once he had felt like an outsider struggling to meet other people's expectations, he now understood that his careful attention to detail and respect for craftsmanship had always been valuable qualities that others had simply failed to recognize. The same skills that made him a good mechanic, patience, precision, the ability to see potential in broken things, had made him a good father and partner as well. Claire's expertise had helped him understand that preservation wasn't about clinging to the past, but about honoring what was valuable while adapting to present needs. Together, they had created something that served both history and community, proving that individual success could enhance rather than compete with collective well-being. The story that had begun with mockery and judgment had transformed into something that honored both struggle and triumph, loss and discovery, the weight of the past and the promise of the future. As they walked back to the house together after checking on the art students one final time, Jake's fingers found the smooth surface of the paintbox handle that Lily carried, connecting him to the grandfather he had never really known, but whose legacy had given them all a second chance at happiness. The box had become a symbol of continuity and hope, proof that treasures could be preserved across generations by people who understood their true value even when the rest of the world remained blind to their significance. The lights of Millfield twinkled below them as they climbed the hill toward home, the same town that had once been quick to judge now proud to claim them as their own. The transformation hadn't been without challenges, managing sudden fame, dealing with the complexities of foundation, governance, balancing public access with family privacy, but each obstacle had been met with the same careful attention that Jake had always brought to fixing broken engines. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new visitors to the Heritage Center, new students eager to learn about art and history from people who had lived the story they were telling. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that Jake had never dared to imagine during the darkest days after Rebecca's death, when simply surviving each day had seemed like the most he could hope for. But tonight, as he tucked Lily into the bedroom that had once belonged to her great-grandfather, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that some stories have happy endings after all. The house settled around them with the creaking comfort of old wood and careful restoration, its rooms filled with the presence of multiple generations who had found love and purpose within its walls. Outside, the Vermont landscape stretched into darkness, punctuated by scattered farmhouse lights, each one representing another family's story of persistence and hope. The paint box sat on Lily's dresser next to her latest sketches, tomorrow's lessons waiting to unfold in colors that would carry John Whitmore's vision forward into an uncertain but promising future. And in the master bedroom down the hall, Jake and Claire fell asleep to the sound of autumn wind in maple trees that had witnessed the entire remarkable transformation of a struggling single father's inheritance from burden to blessing, from mockery to miracle, from junk to the foundation of a new and better life.